So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for taking the time out. I know you're very busy. Congratulations. First of all, congratulations on the Looney Tunes cartoons. They're just every
Thank you.
department, music included, knocking out of the park. They're fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, as a long time, I was going to be an animator at one point in my life. As a longtime fan of Looney Tunes, we're always, hesitant about going and seeing new projects, and it was really just hit all cylinders. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a lot of people saw this project and kind of rolled their eyes and thought yet another reboot, but they really did it right. It's exciting to be a part of it.
I'd like to discuss first of all, Carl. This is nothing new for you working with Warner Brothers. You go back a ways with the studio. Can you talk about the difference between or similarities between working on some of the classic cartoons like Animaniacs and Tasmania versus working on the actual classic Looney Tunes?
Well, from my perspective, the most noticeable difference is on this one, the creative team is really very easygoing. On some of the other projects that I've done, there's been a lot of tension, creative tension. There's a lot of notes going back and forth, tweaking things and changing things. But on this one, the two creative heads, Pete Braungart and Alex Kerwin, have really trusted us, Joshua and I both, on how we approach things, and comparatively gotten very few notes, very few changes to do. So in that respect, it's been a breeze, a joy to work on. And I think the more that, for myself, the more I have confidence that the creative team is liking what I'm doing, the more I'm able to really stop second guessing what I'm doing, and makes it more enjoyable.
Joshua, now your previous work is considerably different. A lot of your previous work is considerably different than Looney Tunes.
Sure.
Even your animated work is fairly different. How were you brought into the project?
I have been wanting to work on a project like this for a long time, and so when it came up, I knew that I didn't really have the the same kind of credits like Carl has, but I felt like I had enough past work that I could cobble together a demo that said, hey, these things are like Looney Tunes. And then I did, after that, I did like a test with some animation where I brought in an orchestra, a small orchestra, and recorded it exactly how I would want to do it. And I think that for me, it was very much like, I did need to demonstrate like, hey, this is this is in my wheelhouse, because it might not be obvious looking at the projects that I've done in the past. But I do think for me, my love of music really starts with animation and Looney Tunes as a kid, and my interest in comedy grew from that. My interest in music grew from that, and so it's a daunting. We're each writing 500 minutes of music for this, and so it's a daunting assignment. But I do think that at least for me, I'm trying to tap into just like a flow, and just like Carl was saying, the confidence that you get when your executive producer says, "That's great, do another," that really contributes, that trust contributes like a feeling that you can just let it flow, and there's no time to really go back and second guess yourself. And I try to make a habit of not even listening to something that I've written earlier in the cartoon until I'm done, because otherwise I'll just go back and keep tweaking things. You just have to keep moving forward. And I think that when you do that, it gives the music a sense of forward momentum and immediacy that I relate to as someone who's worked with a lot of improvising comedians,
Right.
Where you're just reacting to the comedy and letting that drive your choices and not worrying about everything being, perfect.
You are both obviously going to be compared to Carl Stalling, which I think is what the audience expects out of these shorts. How do you approach emulating his style but still keeping your own voice in your music?
Joshua, you want to go first on that one?
Sure. I think that, you know, you learn to create music through emulation, in your for any of us in our earliest state. So, whether you're trying to, for me, I was trying to emulate the jazz musicians that I love the most. And so I would, practice a Bud Powell solo until I could play it note for note. And then I would try to solo like Bud Powell would solo. And so you kind of assimilate the vocabulary, and then you kind of throw it away and try to be yourself. But you can always dial that. I think for a lot of musicians, we're able to dial, the space between like an existing language and our own inhibited choices. And so I think that it's just something that we're constantly calibrating on this. I think Carl and I have each put in our 10,000 hours of just enjoying Looney Tunes,
Right.
and getting the sound in our ear. And so you're just channeling it. You're channeling the energy of it, the sensibility of it, but you also have freedom. And I think that it wouldn't really serve anybody if we were constantly changing it because Carl Stalling wouldn't do that.
Right.
I think that you need that sense of freedom to be yourself, for the music to really sing, and not feel like you're tiptoeing around or being too careful. And the artists are the same way. Bugs has, he's on model, like they have their model sheets, but then they can take that caricature and really push it, and do something extreme and hilarious when you pause the frame and you see Daffy Duck's eyes are squares for a second, and he's pulled his head in half. And so I think similarly for us, it's like the on model is the voice of Carl Stalling in our heads, but then we can pull it apart a bit.
Yeah, I think it's like in any other study of art, you got to know the rules before you can break them. And for me, and I think that the history of composition is the history of ripping off the composers that came before you. So it's just part of growing as an artist to analyze a piece of work that you admire, internalize it, and then find a way to say it in your own words. And it's the same in painting. It's the same in sculpture. So for me, having Carl Stalling there as the person who invented the language gives me a place to start. And then, rather than just starting from a blank sheet of paper, it's a departure point. And then from there, I can do it the way that it speaks to me. But yeah, it's nice to not be totally blocked into exactly what would Carl Stalling do.
Yeah, and I think for both of us, like we love that music so much that if it's like it would almost like be disrespectful to copy it so closely that you weren't adding anything to it, because Carl Stalling was adding on to a tradition that he had inherited from silent movies, and so we have to bring new things to it. It would be selling the craft of it short, I think, if we didn't.
I'm curious how each of you approach Mickey Mousing, which is pretty much the foundation for a lot of these cartoons, where you're acting, the orchestra's acting as a Foley artist, basically. You're punctuating the action. I'm curious as to how each of you, and something Stalling went back to his Disney days. I'm curious how each of you approach it and how you determine when to lay off of that, when to pull back, and when to really push it hard.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and that fine line between how closely you mirror the images or not is always moving, depending on the situation. Part of it is listening to what the sound effects people do, and I've got a chance to kind of listen critically to the sound effects designer on this, and he's being very careful about which things he hits with which elements. And a lot of times I'm finding it's better if I just get out of the way and let him do what and if they've got this incredible palette of sort of vintage sounds mixed with newer ones. And I think at the beginning of the series, I was doing a lot more of catching things musically that I didn't really need to because I was duplicating a lot of the action that they were doing in the sound effects. Um, as the series has gone on and I've listened to more of the things that he's done, it's become a little bit easier to figure out, here's a place where I can lay out, let the sound effect take it, or here's a place where I know that the music is really going to be funny if I do it instead of the sound effects. So for me, kind of establishing that balance, and even though there's no dialogue between myself and the sound effects editor, I'm learning the kinds of things that he will do just based on what he's done before.
You find that to be the case as well, Joshua?
Yeah, I do. I think, I don't feel a mandate to hit anything. I think it's just make a funny choice, like, and make it feel coherent and tuneful, because there's a thread of a tune. That's why it's called Looney Tunes. And so you're just connecting this line from the beginning to the end. And I think similarly, I was hitting a lot more just because I didn't, at the beginning of the show, because I didn't necessarily know what choices the sound designer was going to make. And, it was pre-COVID, so we would be at the mix and there would be a conversation, and, we could mute the music here and you could put the sound in, and you could have a conversation about what that would be. But really what that was is it was like we were kind of just getting to know each other's sensibilities. And so now we don't really need to have that conversation. I can just make a choice when I'm sketching it, and leave that space clear. And then when the sound designer gets the music track from me, he'll know that I left that space. It doesn't even need to be an email, hey, I left you that space. It's just there.
Right.
We know what to do. So there's a nice, I think it would have been harder to start the show in the pandemic, but since we had a solid year plus of lead-in to it, it allowed us to build those relationships with the different moving parts in the show.
How's the pandemic affected your, I apologize, Carl, how's the pandemic affected your production?
Well, in some ways drastically, in some ways not. When the show was first imagined, the idea would be that there would be several times a year a live recording session with a live orchestra, and then everything else would be done with smaller ensembles. We got about a year into that, and then coronavirus happened, and so suddenly recording with live orchestras is out. So we had to rely on the smaller ensemble that we had come up with. For myself, what I did, what I had done from the beginning was I was working with several instrumentalists who were recording themselves at home. And so just because of logistics, that was the process that I had established from the very beginning. So once the coronavirus lockdowns happened, it didn't affect that at all. I just kept rolling with the way we had it. Joshua, I think it affected your process a little bit more than mine, right?
A little more, yeah. I mean, I was doing sessions with everyone in the room in LA, mostly at Capitol Studios. And so I was able to develop the shorthand with the players so that they would know stylistically what to do. And, some of the things about how I notate things. But now that everything is remote, I spend a lot more time prepping the sessions before I send them to them so that they can be as efficient as we would be when we were in the room, because we would just tear through lots of music per hour, to get through what we needed to do. And the nice thing, and Carl had this benefit from the beginning because he was already working with everybody isolated, but you do get a great clear mix when every person is perfectly isolated, and you can really balance everything nicely. And I think honestly it works well because the art is assembled that way too. It's not, most of it's created by hand, but digitally.
Right.
And there is a clarity to the artwork where you can kind of take apart each layer of it and kind of imagine how it all stacks on top of each layer. And I think now that we're doing these smaller ensembles, with each person isolated, it kind of fits aesthetically with the look of the show. So I think it's good. But as soon as we're able to get in the room together, I'll look forward to that too.
Actually, I spoke with Michael Giacchino not that long ago, and he said he is probably going to continue working remotely even after the pandemic, because he's finding that he's getting various different takes from all the different musicians that he wouldn't have gotten, in person, and it's allowing him to pick and choose some unique takes from each artist. So I think that's an interesting way. It may affect how a lot of production goes on going forward.
Yeah, it's shifted a lot of responsibilities onto the players now to be their own recording engineers and have their own spaces
Sure.
that are soundproof and all that goes into that. But it has had some definite positives to it. In addition to the players not having to spend all the time on the road fighting traffic in LA and being able to work in their jammies. So it has some positives to it. And I certainly, from a creative point of view, having all of our creative meetings over Zoom has made at least my time much more efficient, that I don't have to spend time driving to the studio and driving back. And I miss the face-to-face interaction, but it's a much more efficient way to work. And I'm hoping to be able to continue doing it too.
Yeah, it'd be nice if every project starts in person and then we split out into into pandemic.
You're each working with your own set of musicians that you're familiar with, I imagine?
Yeah, I think there's some overlap. Rob Shear is your trumpet player too, right, Joshua?
Yes.
Yeah. So we both bring our community of players that we know.
Right.
And then when it's time to get together for an orchestral session, we've been comparing our lists and agreeing on who we want to be there as part of the band.
Yeah, it's neat to have an ensemble that's kind of an amalgamation of various musical relationships that each of us bring to the table.
Now, they're like the original Looney Tunes, so there's a handful of different directors on these. So what's been your experience working with different directors on different projects?
Well, I like that each director has a different point of view in the way that Looney Tunes has always been. Like, you could always tell this is a Chuck Jones, this is a Bob Clampett. Like,
Right.
they're just night and day from each other. And David Gemmell and Kenny Pinninger and Brian Kramer, like Pete Braungart, these directors, you kind of know what kinds of things make them laugh, what kinds of comedy they're drawn to. And so I think that for me, it's like playing to those strengths. Kenny does these amazing set pieces, these just elaborate, fantastical set pieces that go into abstraction. And so when I get one of those, for instance, I'm like rolling up my sleeves. Okay, like we got to do something great, that really feels like deserving of all the time that went into that. And David Gemmell is very physical comedy. It's all about the timing. It's almost like you could imagine it in a comic book where you're looking at the panels, like the setups are just so methodical. And so I think over time, you learn, and then you learn who the board artists are and the sensibilities they bring, and you really respect what they're bringing to the table, and so you just want to like play to those strengths.
Sure.
And one thing that's interesting with this show versus some others is that the Pete Braungart and Alex Kerwin are really allowing the directors to express their own style versus trying to make the directors conform to an overall style for the show. And I think part of that is because the Looney Tunes style has already been established and everybody knows what that brand is. So within that, the directors can kind of show some individuality and do their own thing, versus some other shows where it's all about trying to focus on exactly what the brand of the show is.
Traditionally, Stalin used to bring in classical music, contemporary music, references. Do you find that you're going to different classical pieces or modern references into your pieces?
That's an interesting thing. I think both Joshua and I take it as kind of a challenge to work in new classical references whenever we can. There's sort of a standard go-to list that Carl Stalling always used for classical musical references. But then there's also the popular tunes that he used. And because copyright things work differently now, we have to make sure that when we use a popular tune or a classical tune, that it's in the public domain.
Yeah, and the worldwide public domain too, not just
Sure.
US public domain.
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky, and there's a whole procedure that we have of checking a tune, and they check it with legal, and they check it with all of the music publishers, and once that's been approved by everybody, then yes, we can use the tune. And it's a little extra hassle, but it's part of the style, and it's part of what makes this project fun. And being able to work in some unusual classical musical references is really fun too.
Yeah, I definitely relish being able to quote something that has not been quoted in Looney Tunes, and kind of like the canon. So like I was able to bring in a Mozart piano or a string quartet that's known as The Hunt for an Elmer chasing bugs scene. And there's an episode where, spoiler alert, Porky and Daffy go to hell just for a second. They realize where they are and they leave. But so I was able to use Totem Toms by Liszt, which I'm very confident was not used in Looney Tunes before. And my personal little joke is working in Beethoven's First Symphony, which never gets any love, but I think is wonderful. So I work it in when I can. Oh, and also for me, I love the funeral dirge in the third Beethoven symphony, the Eroica symphony. So like when a character is marching off to die, like rather than doing the Chopin, which we'll do sometimes, the funeral march, I like to quote from Beethoven just to change it up a little bit.
That's fine. I know you guys are busy. I just have one last question for you. I'm curious as to each of your writing processes, because on feature or any other films or shorts, really, I would imagine one of the first things you do is find the emotional beats. But that's probably not the case here, I imagine. So I'm curious as to what your writing process is like.
I think Joshua and I have very different writing processes in terms of the nuts and bolts of it. Joshua, do you want to describe yours first, or?
Sure. I'm originally an improvising pianist. So for me, it's about, I'm pretty freestyle in that I will start with the tempo that I need at the given moment and improvise to click, but then go back and change things. But essentially just move from left to right. And then when I need a new tempo, I'll make the adjustment that I need and try to do it in a way that the players can follow along with it. So you're not just like, try to set it up. So I'm thinking about having to conduct it, even if I'm not literally conducting it now that we're all separate. And really just trying to let the music flow out of me. And so I'm not really like marking things in advance, but what I do is I have my notes from when we've spotted. So I'll see like, oh, we need to quote this specific thing here. So I'll make sure that I work it in as I go through. And then once I have what I think of as like the skeleton of the composition as a piano sketch, then I go and I start adding rhythm section instruments and orchestra instruments and deciding what is going to be recorded by live players and build it once I've done the whole composition.
And I wish I your keyboard abilities and improvisational abilities, but I'm not nearly the piano player you are. So when I start something, I look at there are certain cues, like a character's footsteps. I'll figure out at what tempo that character is walking, or if there's something else musically or physically going on, that will kind of define my tempo. And then I'll go through maybe a minute or so of music and just figure out the tempo first. and the tempo changes. So you get kind of this grid that's set. And then I'll go back and I'll start filling in the notes. But it really takes almost half of my time figuring out the tempo and the tempo changes and how this thing is going to be structured. So on this kind of music, it's not so much about trying to figure out what the motivation is or the character insights, the emotional impact. It's more about the nuts and bolts of how am I going to get that safe to fall out of the sky and hit the person right on the downbeat. So it's really half the battle is just the technique of getting the timing. And then from there, for me, it's pencil and paper and figuring it out note by note. How's everything going to fit into that grid?
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Again, congratulations. I would love to watch these on the big screen with an audience someday. That'd be fantastic. They deserve an audience.
It's interesting. We got to go to a premiere of this a couple years ago. They had the first batch of these done. They were taking them to the Annecy Film Festival, and they got the whole crew and all their families and everybody together in a theater on the Warner Brothers lot. And we got to watch it in a big theater with a bunch of people. And watching animation in a crowd is a completely different experience than watching it individually at home, because you get to hear what people laugh at and how people react to things. And it's really kind of a magical thing that very few people get to experience. And I really hope I get to do that again sometime, to hear a group of people react to something on a screen.
Yeah, you really need that to pick up, like because the audience tells you that things are funny that you might have not even realized.
Yeah.
I remember seeing a Hitchcock movie at the Arrow a couple of years ago. I can't remember which one, but I didn't realize that like the first third of the movie was a comedy. I just thought of it as this very serious film, but the audience just laughed with it. And I think, obviously with the Looney Tunes, that it's funny, but I really don't like having to send one of these videos off and that it's not going to be watched while I'm like on a Zoom call, even, because I want to know if it's working. Like just being able to hear on a Zoom call somebody chuckling or laughing at a joke is the gratification that you need to feel like, okay, I'm doing it right.
Well, gentlemen, again, thanks again, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks. Take care.
Cheers.